They were not just queens. They were living goddesses. In the golden courts of ancient Egypt, draped in lapis lazuli and wrapped in linen as fine as spider silk, the women of the throne were seen as walking embodiments of Hathor, Isis, or Sekhmet. But behind the shimmering gold masks and perfumed oils was a truth far darker than any temple inscription dared to reveal. Power in Egypt was not inherited. It was taken. And to keep it, one often had to feed forces far older and more demanding than the gods themselves. The legend of Egypt has always been told in the language of beauty. Cleopatra dissolving pearls in wine. Nefertiti with a face carved like perfection itself. Hatshepsut crowned in sacred incense. But beneath the honeyed myths, whispered by priests and recorded in cryptic hieroglyphs, there lies a hidden ritual, one that spoke not of beauty, but of blood. A queen was not preserved by oils alone. She was preserved by sacrifice. Sometimes animal, sometimes thought. Even the common people believed it. The Nile did not flood because it wished to. It flooded because someone had pleased it, or paid it. Every aspect of Egyptian life moved with the rhythm of cosmic balance. Ma'at, they called it, the eternal equilibrium between order and chaos. If a queen failed to maintain this balance, her kingdom would starve, her people would revolt, and her spirit would be devoured in the afterlife by the crocodile-headed demon Ammit. For a male pharaoh, strength was proven through conquest. But for a queen, her power was tested in silence, behind closed walls, in chambers where no scribe was ever allowed to write. Blood was sacred. It was not seen as gore or filth, but as life condensed. Priests collected it from bowls during offerings, storing it in alabaster jars lined with honey and wine. They used it to paint protection sigils on sarcophagi and smear it across doors to repel evil spirits. If blood could guard the dead on their eternal journey, could it not preserve the living as well? Could it not keep a queen young? Could it not make her irresistible? Could it not bind loyalty to her name like iron shackles? So the queens obeyed the oldest law of power. If life is stored in blood, then blood must be worn like armor. Some accounts speak of red-dyed milk baths infused with crushed petals and hematite dust. Others speak of something thicker, something warm, something that came from the veins of maidens or animals slaughtered under moonlight. A queen lying in a pool of crimson, not screaming, not trembling, but silent. Eyes closed, breathing slowly, as if listening to the heartbeat of the gods beneath her skin. The rituals were never publicly acknowledged, but their traces are everywhere. Temple inscriptions referring to renewal through essence. Burial jars labeled not with wine or oil, but with symbols meaning vitality. Cosmetic jars found with strange residue, too rich in iron to be pigment alone. And in the oldest myths, myths far older than the pyramids, goddesses maintain their immortality not by prayer, but by drinking life from the defeated. Hathor, the benevolent mother goddess, once transformed into a lioness and massacred mankind, drinking rivers of blood until she laughed herself into drunkenness. They celebrated this story every year. They called it the Festival of Drunkenness. The queens, who were believed to be her earthly reflections, remembered. But this was not vanity. It was war. A woman on the throne was always one whisper away from being called a temptress, a sorceress, a foreigner. Even Cleopatra, beloved in legend, was mocked by Roman writers as a witch who used potions and rituals to enslave men. A queen could not afford to age. She could not afford fragility. She could not afford mortality. If blood gave her even a fraction more control over her husband, her priests, her rivals, then it was not cruelty. It was strategy. And so, the marble queens of history may have sparkled with cosmetics and perfumes, but beneath the fragrance of lotus oil, there was another scent. Faint, metallic, hidden beneath the sweetness. The scent of preserved power. They called it beauty, but it was never truly about beauty. A queen's face was not her vanity, it was her weapon. In a world where armies answered only to men, where priests recited laws older than language itself, a woman did not wield swords or spears. She wielded perception. Every gesture, every painted eye, every ritual she performed was a message to the gods, to her enemies, and to the people who whispered in the markets late at night. If her skin glowed like the statues of goddesses carved in gold, if her presence radiated something unearthly, then descent died before it could form. Power in Egypt was not simply taken. It had to be believed in. And belief required illusion. Blood was the most convincing illusion of all. The palace attendants spoke of evenings of transformation, when the queen would retreat into inner chambers where only the most trusted priestesses could enter. Outside, music would continue, harps echoing through moonlit courtyards. Officials would feast, pretending not to wonder what was happening behind the veil of embroidered curtains. Servants moved in and out carrying bowls, basins, folded cloths. Some were filled with wine, others with ground myrrh and resin, and some, unmistakably, with something thicker. No one asked. Not because they didn't know, but because knowing was dangerous. For the Egyptians, blood was more than flesh. It was Ka, the life force that flowed between the realms of the living and the dead. To bathe in it was not an act of cruelty, but of absorption, taking in the vitality of another being to bolster one's own divine nature. Queens were not seen as fragile consorts. They were embodiments of the Eye of Are, the wrathful feminine, capable of fertility and destruction in equal measure. When a queen immersed herself in blood, she was not merely cleansing her body. She was declaring ownership over life itself. Yet not all blood was equal. Bull's blood, thick and steaming from ritual sacrifice, was believed to carry strength and virility. Goose blood, used in fertility rites, was prized for its association with rebirth. But the rarest, the most potent, was that taken from the young, the unwithered essence, as old texts imply. It was not always taken through death. Sometimes it was drawn in small amounts, mixed with honey and pomegranate oil, applied as ointment across the throat and wrists, whispered over by chanting priestesses. Sometimes it was far less gentle. The lines between medicine, magic, and murder were thin, drawn only by necessity. The queens did not see themselves as tyrants. They saw themselves as guardians of eternity. What was one life weighed against the Nile, the crops, the beating heart of a civilization that stretched for thousands of years? If a drop of blood could prevent famine, could silence rebellion, could keep the throne unchallenged, was it not mercy? The queens believed so. Or rather, they had to believe so. Guilt was a luxury of those without crowns. Even Cleopatra, remembered now as a seductress, understood the brutal mathematics of survival. She used perfumes laced with rare resins that priests claimed were mixed with sacred essence. She slept on linens stained with alchemical mixtures intended to keep the body supple and inviolate. Roman historians mocked her, calling her a witch, a temptress, a master of forbidden glamour. But mockery was only fear wearing a mask. They did not understand that in Egypt, beauty was not decoration. It was dominance. But these rituals held another, quieter purpose. They were not only for others to witness. They were for the queen herself. Imagine the burden of waking every day knowing that a single wrinkle could be seen as weakness. A single illness could spark whispers of divine abandonment. A single moment of emotional softness could invite the knives of rivals. In such a world, the bath of blood was not indulgence. It was armor against time itself. Every immersion said, "I will not decay. I will not be forgotten. I will not yield." The attendants would dry her carefully afterward, dabbing the crimson sheen with cloths soaked in lotus water until her flesh gleamed, not red but luminous. They would rub scented oils along her arms, braid her hair, line her eyes with kohl. And when she emerged, calm, serene, radiant, no one would see what she had been covered in moments before. They would only see divinity. They would bow. Whispers spread like wind across the city. Some said the queen had discovered the secret to immortality. Others claimed she was no longer entirely human. Some feared her. Some adored her. But all obeyed. And that, above all, was the goal. The rituals were always spoken of in symbols, never in direct words. Temple walls showed goddesses holding bowls of red liquid, surrounded by dancers and incense. Official texts referred to vital offerings and renewal libations. But symbols do not appear on their own. Behind every elegant inscription, there were hands that carried basins, feet that walked dark corridors, and hearts that trembled at what was being asked of them. A queen could not stain herself with the logistics of power. That burden belonged to others: servants, priests, physicians, those who operated in shadows so the throne could shine in light. The blood had to be fresh. That was non-negotiable. Cold blood was lifeless, devoid of spirit, unworthy of ritual. So collection often happened at night, when silence muted objections. Animals were the most convenient source: calves, goats, and birds raised in temple farms specifically for sacrifice. In some cases, the priests would conduct the rituals themselves, chanting prayers as they slit the throats gently, catching the flow into golden bowls lined with salt and crushed petals to slow coagulation. They worked quickly, reverently, as if afraid that hesitation would anger the gods. To them, it was purification. To the animals, it was death. But death in Egypt was never seen as an ending. It was a transaction. Yet animals were not always enough. There are scattered records, scratched hastily onto ostraca, hidden in private tombs, of chosen maidens being taken from rural towns and brought to the palace for holy service. Officially, they became handmaidens or temple singers. Unofficially, they became donors. Some were treated gently, offered fine linens and sweet wine before being pricked by needles of bronze. A small vial here, a handful of droplets there, enough to mix into oils and ointments without killing. But others were not so fortunate. When the stars aligned, when the queen's health faltered, when omens suggested imbalance, greater sacrifices were deemed necessary. No historian dares write this directly, but traces of it lie between the lines. A burial site discovered near Thebes contained bodies of young women with no funerary rites, no amulets, no prayers, no attempt to preserve their souls. Their bones showed no signs of plague or famine. Only precise punctures along the neck and wrists, as if drained intentionally. Such bodies were not forgotten by accident. They were erased by design. A queen could not be associated with such acts. But absence speaks as loudly as inscription. The palace staff lived in constant duality, publicly honoring the queen with songs and praises, privately watching buckets of crimson carried past them on linen-covered trays. Some would avert their eyes. Others would stare, hypnotized by the color, wondering what it would feel like to touch. Fear did not always repel. Sometimes it seduced. There were rules, even in silence. No man was allowed to witness the queen's bathing rites, only priestesses and eunuchs who had proven loyalty beyond doubt. These attendants would stand barefoot on cool stone floors, breathing slowly so as not to disturb the sanctity of the moment. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not react, even when the basin was filled to the brim and steam rose in red tendrils like ghosts. The queen would step in slowly, 1 foot at a time, submerged to her thighs. The liquid clung to her like molten silk. It was always warm, always humming with life just departed. In those moments, the attendants swore she changed. Her breathing altered. Her face, usually composed and distant, softened or hardened depending on the night. Some said she whispered prayers. Others claimed she laughed. A few believed she went somewhere else entirely, not asleep, but traveling, communicating with forces no one else could see. Afterward, when she emerged, the air would feel charged, heavy, as if lightning had passed through the room. No one dared touch her until she signaled permission. She was not merely a woman then. She was something volatile. But these rituals had consequences even for those beyond the palace. Rumors trickled into the streets like runoff from the Nile during flood season. Mothers warned their daughters not to stare at palace guards too long, in case they were taken. Farmers whispered that cattle vanished not from thieves, but from royal demand. Some believed the queen's beauty was too perfect to be natural. Others believed she had sold her soul. Priests would counter such talk during festivals, reminding people that Hathor herself had drunk blood to restore balance to the world. If a goddess could do so, why not her earthly reflection? Still, reverence and fear were not opposites in Egypt. They were one and the same. To worship something was to acknowledge its power to destroy. And the queens understood this well. Their beauty was not meant to comfort. It was meant to humble. Occasionally, a queen would allow herself to be seen, not fully, but glimpsed. draped in translucent white, walking through temple halls at dawn, her skin shining with an impossible radiance. Onlookers would fall to their knees, unsure whether they had seen holiness or horror. That uncertainty was intentional. Mystery was currency. The less they knew, the more they obeyed. Even foreign envoys felt it. Roman and Greek diplomats wrote of Egyptian queens who seemed untouched by time, whose presence weighed upon the room like perfume and thunder. They mocked the rituals they did not understand, calling them barbaric and occult. But they still trembled when standing before her. That was victory. The blood dried eventually, but its memory lingered on skin, in breath, in dreams. The queens did not simply preserve their youth. They preserved their legend. And legends do not age. They expand. Power preserved by blood was never peaceful. It did not sit softly on the skin like perfume. It crawled beneath it like fire. A queen who tasted such rituals could never return to ordinary governance. She became dependent, not on the substance itself, but on the certainty it offered. When one bath could restore youth, when one secret rite could silence fate, the world outside the chamber felt unbearably fragile. Every court meeting, every smile from a servant, every glance from a guard became a potential threat. For beauty could be bought. Loyalty could be bribed. But fear had to be maintained. And so, the same ritual that made her invincible also made her obsessed. The queen no longer saw faces. She saw risks. Which advisor smiled too much? Which concubine looked too radiant? Which priest whispered for too long in temple shadows? The palace became a stage of silent warfare, where no sword was drawn, yet daggers hid behind every courteous gesture. Poison was more common than olive oil. Wine could be salvation or execution. A compliment could be mockery in disguise. The queen learned to speak in riddles, to reward confusion, to keep even her most trusted attendants uncertain of their standing. If they could not predict her, they could not betray her. But paranoia alone could not sustain a throne. Control required performance. And the queens of Egypt mastered spectacle like generals mastered battlegrounds. They appeared in public rarely, but when they did, they orchestrated all with precision. Their eyes lined in kohl like sharpened blades, their bodies wrapped in linen so white it glowed beneath the sun, their necklaces clinking like distant thunder. They carried no weapons, they were the weapon. One gesture, one tilt of the chin, one pause in speech could redirect an entire court's allegiance. And yet behind every grand procession, preparations were as calculated as military campaigns. Days before an appearance, attendants would coat her skin in layers of ointments, some scented with lotus, others with ingredients that had no pleasant smell at all. An underlayer of something metallic. Something that clung. Foreign emissaries would arrive expecting seduction. They found something far more unsettling, certainty. The queen did not tempt. She commanded. She did not ask. She declared. Men who imagined themselves conquerors suddenly felt like schoolboys standing before a headmistress. Rome boasted of breaking nations. Yet in her presence, even Rome hesitated. That was the true purpose of the ritual, not to look young, but to appear eternal. Still, eternity was a lonely throne. Even those closest to her could not look at her without remembering the whispers. They bowed, but they trembled. And trembling love is not love. It is fear dressed in silk. The queen knew this. She could feel it in every touch that stopped too early, every laugh that died too quickly. So she learned to stop expecting tenderness. Instead, she demanded reverence. If she could not be loved as a woman, she would be worshipped as a goddess. Yet what is worship without sacrifice? The priests grew bolder, sensing opportunity. They encouraged the queen's reliance on ritual, offering new concoctions, new ceremonies, each more elaborate than the last. A bath for beauty. A salve for fertility. A draught to inspire favor from the gods. Blood mixed with wine. Blood mixed with milk. Blood steeped with crushed gemstones. Each presented in gold bowls with sacred chants. Each accompanied by warnings, skip this, and the gods may turn their faces away. The queen listened. Whether out of faith or habit, no one knew. But rituals had a cost that silver could not always cover. When animals ran short, when omens grew heavy, When the queen's reflection showed the faintest curve of exhaustion, decisions were made quietly. Servants went missing. Slaves disappeared from records. No one asked. To ask was to imply knowledge. And knowledge could be fatal. The walls of the palace became witnesses, absorbing secrets like stone sponges. The marble floors, once cold and pure, darkened over time in places no one scrubbed. Some stains were too deep. The queen walked over them without looking down. Did she feel guilt? Perhaps once. Perhaps in the beginning, when the first life was taken for her sake, she hesitated. Perhaps she even wept. But tears dry faster than fear. And fear dries into resolve. In her mind, she was not consuming innocence. She was protecting destiny. Egypt did not need a kind ruler. It needed an unbreakable one. That belief hardened into doctrine. She began to see herself not as a participant in ritual, but as its rightful center. When she bathed, she imagined the blood not as sacrifice, but as tribute. When she painted it across her arms before ceremony, she did not flinch. She felt crowned. Each drop was an oath. Each incision was a covenant between mortality and divinity. The people outside sensed the shift. Some adored her even more. They threw lotus petals in her path, chanting her name as if it were a prayer. They claimed her beauty proved she was chosen by the gods. They begged to be near her, even if only for a glimpse. Others recoiled. They avoided her gaze in public. They left offerings at crossroads, hoping the spirits would shield them from her attention. They whispered that her beauty was too flawless, her skin too perfect, not born of nature but of consumption. But both reactions served her equally. Love made her adored. Fear made her obeyed. And obedience was the only true currency of power. In the quiet of her chambers, she sometimes touched her face, tracing her cheekbones with curious fingers. Did she still recognize herself? Or had she become a sculpture wearing flesh? The mirror offered no answer. Mirrors never do. They only reflect what the world demands to see. And the world demanded a goddess. So she remained one. No one understood the true danger of beauty better than the queen herself. To most, beauty was an ornament, a pleasurable asset to be praised, painted, or admired. To her, it was a weapon so sharp it could slit a throat with a smile. Men did not fall to swords nearly as easily as they fell to illusion. A blade could pierce the body, but fascination could enslave the soul. And once a man desired her, he ceased to be an enemy. He became a servant, willingly or otherwise. But beauty alone was not enough. Any maiden could be pretty. Any dancer could flutter her lashes and sway her hips. The queen's allure was something entirely different, not sweet, not soft, but dangerous. It was the knowledge in her eyes when she looked at a man and saw what he feared, not what he wanted. She learned to speak to that fear. A general who prided himself on strength would receive a touch that made him feel weak. A priest who prided himself on holiness would be met with a glance that made him feel sinful. She did not seduce bodies. She seduced identities. Foreign envoys came believing they would negotiate terms. They left speaking in poetry. Some swore that her very presence was perfumed with myrrh and crushed lilies, though none saw her physically apply it. Others claimed that when she looked at them, their hearts raced not with love, but with dread masked as longing. They could not distinguish desire from submission, and that was precisely how she trapped them. But such power came at a cost only she could feel. Every time she bared her smile, every time she let a man believe he had charmed her, she carved another slice off her own humanity. She did not love. She observed. She did not feel attraction. She calculated risk. Her lips, which others dreamed of kissing, tasted only the metallic memory of ritual baths. Her hands, so soft to those who touched them, still remembered the warmth of fresh offerings. And yet the world saw only glow, not the ghosts beneath the glow. Some men thought themselves clever. They whispered that they would conquer her as Rome had conquered nations. They underestimated the truth, that she allowed their approach so she could study them closer. When a conqueror entered her chambers, smelling of arrogance and wine, she listened not to his words but to his silence. Did his eyes dart toward the guards, or to her throat? Did his hands tremble slightly with hunger or with fear? She learned his weaknesses by how he breathed. And when she finally leaned forward, brushing her fingers across his cheek as if yielding, that was when his fate was sealed. For a man who believed he had won her would never notice how deeply he had already knelt. But not every alliance required touch. Some were won with absence. When she wished to humble a man, she denied him entirely. He would wait in her hall for hours, staring at gold pillars and polished floors, listening to the faint echo of distant harps, wondering if she would appear. She rarely did. By the time she finally graced him with her presence days later, he bowed before she even spoke. Desire could lure, but longing could break. In private, the queen reflected on these encounters not with triumph, but with detachment. Were they men? Or were they simply ingredients, not unlike the herbs and unguents that filled her ritual chambers? Each had a purpose. One to secure grain routes. One to silence political rivals. One to redirect Rome's attention elsewhere. They arrived as predators and left as components of her will. Yet there was always danger in such games. For desire, once awakened, did not always remain obedient. Some men became obsessed. They sent offerings daily. Gold bracelets, ivory combs, even caged animals from distant lands. They begged for her favor, not realizing she had already forgotten their names. A few grew desperate, mistaking dismissal for insult. They plotted. They whispered in taverns. They spoke of seeing dark things in her eyes, of hearing whispers in her chambers that did not belong to human tongues. Their fear festered into conspiracy. The queen anticipated this. Passion was easy to ignite, and even easier to weaponize. When rumors of her sorcery began circulating, she did not deny them. She fed them. She allowed stories to spread of how she could turn men to stone with a kiss, how her bathwater moved like living creatures even when untouched, how her shadow sometimes flickered as if it had wings. Terror made loyalty more durable than gold. There were rare moments when she wondered what her life might have been had she been born a simple woman, one who could love without suspicion, age without scrutiny, sleep without precaution. But such thoughts were fleeting. She had long accepted that her life was not her own. She did not belong to passion. She belonged to legacy. Still, there were nights when she lay upon her silk-covered bed, staring at the ceiling painted with constellations, and listened to the sound of her own breath. Slow, controlled, eternal. She remembered the warmth of the baths, the sting of ointments, the scent of resin. She remembered the faces of those she had used, their devotion, their terror. And she whispered a single sentence into the empty room. This is the price of being unforgettable. Men would write about her for centuries. Some would call her beautiful. Others would call her monstrous. But none would forget. And in the end, memory was the only immortality that mattered. The corridors of the temple were silent, save for the whisper of sandals across sandstone floors and the occasional rustle of linen. Light from oil lamps flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Every corner held a story, not of the living, but of those who had passed through, offering themselves to something far older and colder than any queen. This was where Egyptian queens prepared, where priestesses and attendants enacted the dark rituals that would preserve a legacy far beyond flesh and time. It began not with blood, but with anticipation. The air was thick with incense and the faint metallic tang of prior sacrifices. Anyone who entered these chambers immediately understood that life's rules had been rewritten. What seemed like a temple was a crucible, every step bringing one closer to the dissolution of self. The queens themselves rarely participated in the initial stages. They observed, allowing the priestesses to work. And the work was precise. It eroded not just the body of those chosen for ritual, but their will. Prisoners, concubines, and attendants were brought forward under the guise of honor. But the promise was a lie. No one emerged unscarred. The priestesses began with ritual washing, water infused with natron, salts, and herbs, burning the skin, stripping identity, preparing the body as a vessel for the queen's power. Every sound was deliberate. The chanting of oracles was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, a metronome dictating the pace of despair. Attendants whispered the names of gods and ancestors, layering each syllable with expectation. Those chosen felt themselves unraveling under the weight of constant observation. Eyes never left them. Every twitch, every shiver, was noted and used to bend the mind further. Fear became a sculptor, carving a hollow space within, leaving only what was useful for the queen's designs. Pain was part of the ritual, but more potent was the psychological unraveling. Priestesses asked impossible questions. Do you still carry loyalty when all you feel is fear? Do you think yourself worthy of surviving the queen's gaze? Hesitation, falter, or tremor was noted, whispered about, and used to bend the mind further. Sometimes mercy was offered, a soft word, a pause in torment, a brief release of restraint, only to be withdrawn, creating dependence and confusion. The victim began to crave not freedom, but the queen's divine approval. The process was physically brutal yet visually serene. Victims were bound on marble slabs, their bodies bathed in dim torchlight. They felt the cold through their flesh, the tension in ropes biting into wrists and ankles. Priestesses moved like dancers, deliberate, precise, beautiful in cruelty. Each gesture was both art and weapon. Each touch reinforced dominance. Brutality became performance, instilling awe and obedience at once. The queens observed from behind golden screens, silent witnesses to the human fragility that sustained their myths. For them, the ritual was not spectacle but strategy. Blood, pain, and surrender were mediums through which their power flowed outward, beyond the chambers, into palaces and temples. To see someone reduced to this state was not cruelty, it was a statement. Defiance could be dissolved, submission engineered, and through these acts, a queen could assert absolute dominion. By the culmination of the preparation, victims' eyes dulled into a reflective glaze. Limbs stiffened not from exhaustion alone but from realization. Resistance was impossible. Thoughts echoed the chants, craving order, seeking favor. The queen, observing, became both judge and goddess. Fear and reverence merged. Pain became purpose. Survival became surrender. Life itself no longer belonged to them. Finally, the ritual approached its climax, the blood offering. Every stage of preparation converged. The body, cleansed and conditioned, ready to release its essence. The mind, hollowed and malleable, prepared to accept its role. The queen, in ceremonial grandeur, became both judge and goddess. Taking blood was not sustenance alone, it was transference. Every drop carried symbolism. Every gesture was choreographed to instill awe and reinforce the queen's immortal image. Even centuries later, scholars struggled to comprehend the methodical cruelty of these rituals. It was not mere barbarism, but the combination of precision, art, psychology, and devotion. The victims, stripped of agency, became instruments of a power greater than themselves. The queen, bathed in their essence, transcended, her influence echoing across generations. In these chambers, everything served a single purpose: to preserve power, to render human fragility into fuel for immortality. Every act of pain, every whisper, every drop of blood was calculated, not as hatred, but as affirmation of divine necessity. Those who watched, priestesses, attendants, and the queen, witnessed a tragic, beautiful symmetry. Pain had been endured, fear absorbed, identity reshaped, all to feed the eternal image of a queen who refused to be forgotten, who refused to die in anything but legend. They brought her in shackled, but not like a prisoner of war, like an offering not yet worthy of the altar. The chamber she entered was colder than the desert night. Not by temperature, the air was thick and warm with incense, but by intention. It was not a place of rage or chaos. It was a place built for breaking. Torches lined the sandstone walls, their flames trapped behind copper latticework to prevent even a flicker from touching the sacred center of the room. A sunken pit lined with polished limestone, stained faintly pink by countless washings that had never quite erased the memory of blood. At its edge stood women dressed in white linen, flawless, immaculate, watching her with the stillness of statues. They were not guards. They were priestesses. Their faces held neither contempt nor pity. She had seen hatred before, in battles, in rivalries, in the glare of queens faking kindness. But what she saw now was worse than hate. She saw purpose. No one spoke to her as she was forced to her knees. 2 eunuch guards held her by the arms, but their hands were not rough. There was no urgency. No scrambling. They had done this many times and they knew it was not the force that broke someone. It was the patience. Her name had once been spoken with reverence. She had been a noble woman, perhaps even promised as a future wife to a prince. But now, stripped of jewels, smeared with sweat, and bound in coarse rope, she was unremarkable. She tried to summon defiance. She tried to spit at the priestess's feet. But her lips were too dry. Even her anger had abandoned her. A voice, soft but commanding, flowed from behind the priestesses. The high oracle descended. She was older than the others, but ageless in her posture. Draped in a cloak dyed with ochre and hematite, she wore no gold, only symbols etched in blood across her arms. She walked barefoot, and the floor seemed to avoid staining her skin. When she stood before the kneeling captive, she did not look down. She looked through her. "It is a blessing," the oracle said calmly, "to be chosen for her renewal." The captive trembled, choking on her words. "I am not afraid of torture," she forced out, though her voice cracked. "Do what you will." The oracle's expression did not shift. "You misunderstand," she whispered. "We do not torture. Pain alone purifies nothing. Any brute can cause pain. But we do not seek screams." She leaned close, her breath carrying the scent of myrrh. "We seek surrender." The guards laid the captive flat against a stone slab tilted at an incline. Not enough to be comfortable. Not enough to rest. Her arms were stretched outward, bound in leather soaked in oils that prevented chafing, not out of mercy, but because injury given too soon would ruin the process. One priestess approached with a bowl. At first, the captive thought it was water. Then she smelled it. Vinegar and natron salts. Cleansing agents used on corpses. Before she could react, the mixture was poured slowly over her body. She screamed, not from pain but from shock. The liquid bit into every cut, every abrasion, every pore. It was not burning. It was erasing. Stripping scent, sweat, identity, preparing her not as a person, but as a vessel. As she writhed, the priestesses began to chant. Not loud, but low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Senate, cut, spirit. But the words were not blessings. They were claims. The vinegar wash was only the beginning. Next came the beetle ritual. A small wooden box was brought forth, carved with scarab symbols. She had seen scarabs before, sacred insects symbolizing rebirth. She had worn gold jewelry shaped like them. She never imagined feeling them on her skin. When they opened the box, the creatures crawled forward, not swarms, not chaos. Just a few. Placed deliberately. One on her abdomen. One at her throat. One between her breasts. She tried to thrash, but the leather held firm. Every tickle of their legs felt like fire. Every inch they traveled stole another thread of her sanity. She gasped, whimpering, not from violence, but from disgust. This was not grand execution. This was not glorious martyrdom. This was humiliation. Intimate. Prolonged. Inescapable. A priestess leaned down, whispering into her ear, "Do not fear. They do not feed on flesh." The pause. "They feed on fear." The oracle watched without blinking. Once the scarabs had crawled their sacred path, the priestesses carefully collected them, each beetle placed back into its box with gentle reverence. The captive lay trembling. She begged. Not for death. Not for release. She begged to be washed again. She hated herself for it, but she could no longer stand feeling unclean. That was the crack. And the oracle saw it. "Again," she commanded. They washed her, slower this time. Not with vinegar, but with warm scented oils. They stroked her skin like caretakers. It was kindness. But kindness given by captors is not salvation. It is conditioning. The guards loosened her restraints slightly, not enough to free her, but enough to let her think she had been rewarded. And as she lay there, panting, the chanting ceased. Silence. Silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat pounding against her skull. Then came the whisper. Not spoken into her ear, but into her mind. You do not have to suffer, the oracle said softly. Our queen does not desire your pain. She desires your willingness. The captive shook her head weakly. I will never serve her. The oracle regarded her thoughtfully. You already have. She gestured. 2 priestesses stepped forward, each holding a polished bronze mirror. They angled them toward the captive. She saw herself. Not as noble. Not as fierce. But small. Naked. Helpless. Her hair was matted. Her skin blotched with oils and salt. Her eyes wide with desperation. Look at what remains of you, the oracle murmured. Is this the woman who once dined beside princes? Is this the woman who commanded servants? Tears formed without permission. You are dust, the oracle said gently. But dust is sacred. Dust is what we are born from, and what we return to. And when mixed with divine blood, she leaned closer. Dust becomes eternal. There was no more defiance. Only trembling. Only exhaustion. The oracle looked to the priestesses. It is time. They brought the crown. Not the queen's golden diadem. A mock crown, made of bronze thorns. They pressed it onto the captive's scalp slowly, deliberately, puncturing skin just enough to draw blood. Each drop ran down her temples like red tears. Do not think of this as mockery, one priestess whispered. You are being made royal in pain. The oracle nodded. Only those who have bled for the queen may serve her. Only those who have surrendered pride may feed her. She no longer screamed. Not because she was brave, but because her voice had abandoned her. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, not from the cuts, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that resistance now felt foolish. There was no escape. There was no justice. There was only transition. Somewhere deep inside she felt a shift, a silent resignation. Let it be over. Let them drain me. Let them take what they want. Let me be useful to someone even in death. Only trembling. Only exhaustion. The oracle looked to the priestesses. It is time. They brought the crown. Not the queen's golden diadem. A mock crown, made of bronze thorns. They pressed it onto the captive's scalp slowly, deliberately, puncturing skin just enough to draw blood. Each drop ran down her temples like red tears. Do not think of this as mockery, one priestess whispered. You are being made royal in pain. The oracle nodded. Only those who have bled for the queen may serve her. Only those who have surrendered pride may feed her. She no longer screamed. Not because she was brave, but because her voice had abandoned her. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, not from the cuts, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that resistance now felt foolish. There was no escape. There was no justice. There was only transition. Somewhere deep inside she felt a shift, a silent resignation. Let it be over. Let them drain me. Let them take what they want. Let me be useful to someone even in death. She did not speak these words aloud. She didn't need to. The oracle saw it in her eyes. There, she whispered. Now she is ready. The guards approached, not with blades. Not yet. They lifted her gently, as if lifting a sleeping child. Her feet touched the cold sandstone floor. She stood, not because she wished to, but because her body obeyed the hands guiding her. She did not struggle. She did not beg. She walked where she was led. Her mind had been hollowed. Her will had been peeled away. She was no longer a person. She was an offering. And that is how they ensured obedience, not through death, but through surrender. They always believed there would be a way out. Even the strongest men do, right up until the moment they realized the gate they walked through was never meant to be opened from the inside. For the condemned, whether they were Roman soldiers bound to their oaths, Aztec warriors sworn to the gods, Viking berserkers pledged to their jarls, or Egyptian initiates promised eternal wisdom, there was always a moment. A final instant when they understood that destiny was no longer a direction. It was a sentence. And Section 8, this chapter of transformation, was not about pain of the body. It was about the death of choice. They didn't drag their captives anymore. They didn't need to. By now, the screams had quieted. The defiance had burned out. Even their breathing had changed, no longer frantic or desperate, now slow, resigned, like animals who had sensed the storm coming long before the first drop fell. Some of them walked willingly, guided not by chains but by silence, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from the crushing realization that resistance was pointless. After all, what could one mortal do against an empire built on obedience? Against priests who believed their hands were extensions of the gods? Against generals who had killed mercy inside themselves long ago? Against rulers who believed that legacy mattered more than lives? Here, identity faded. No names were spoken. No ranks were honored. Even enemies stood side by side, stripped of the illusions that once separated them. A Roman legionary, broken from punishment. An Aztec captive, marked for sacrifice. An Egyptian scribe who had seen forbidden knowledge. A Viking oathbreaker awaiting blood eagle judgment. For men who once believed themselves unique, now reduced to the same trembling flesh. No one was warrior or noble or slave anymore. They were simply offerings, given not always to gods, but to systems far older and colder than divinity. They were brought into the final chamber, whatever form it took. Sometimes it was a stone-step pyramid, glowing under the torchlight. Sometimes it was a dim colonnade echoing with Latin chants. Sometimes it was a burial hall lined with golden jackals watching from the shadows. Sometimes it was a frozen cliff where howling wind drowned out prayers. But the architecture didn't matter. What mattered was ritual. Because ritual was not for the victim. It was for the onlookers. The priests. The soldiers. The rulers. The crowd. All of them needed reassurance that this wasn't cruelty. That this wasn't madness. That this was necessary. That bloodshed was order. That obedience was survival. That destiny had already been written, and they were merely copyists. The condemned were positioned. Knees forced to the stone. Spines straightened by spears. Foreheads pressed to altars slick with history. Some still whispered to whatever gods would listen. Others stared forward, unblinking, not out of courage, but because fear had calcified inside them. Then came the moment. The one moment when time stood still, when blades were raised, when drums halted, when air itself refused to move that single heartbeat where everything could still be undone. But it never was. Because Section 8, this point of no return, was not about punishment. It was about continuity. One more life to feed the structure. One more sacrifice to keep the gears of empire turning. One more offering to the god no civilization admits it serves, control. Some died screaming. Some died praying. Some, astonishingly, died laughing, not out of joy, but because they finally understood the joke. That civilization was never built on glory. It was built on fear. Not of death, but of disobedience. And so, the blade fell. Or the spear thrust. Or the torch branded. Or the wind carried them over the edge. However it happened, it was done. But this was not truly the end. Because Section 8 always carries a second meaning. Yes, it is the end for the body. But it is the beginning of legend. Blood dries. Bodies decay. But stories do not die. And civilization, though it claims to worship gods, secretly bows to stories. Because if a death is witnessed, if a death is repeated, if a death is ritualized, then it is no longer tragedy. It is law. It is tradition. It is culture. And thus, the point of no return was never meant for the victims. It was meant for the living. Because from this moment onward, no one watching could ever claim ignorance. They knew the cost of defiance. They knew the price of loyalty. They knew, beyond all doubt, that survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most obedient. Power is not taken by the gentle. Immortality is not earned by the meek. And those who wish to be remembered must be willing to stain their legacy red. That truth did not die with Egypt. It simply changed costumes. Today, we do not crown queens in temples or weigh their hearts against feathers. But we do watch as modern rulers, celebrities, magnates, and cultural icons engage in the same eternal war, the war against fading. Queens once bathed in blood. Now, power bathes in visibility. Influence is preserved not through ritual sacrifice, but through algorithms, media cycles, and carefully curated myth. The altars have changed, but the offerings remain the same: identity, image, hunger. What makes the story of Egypt's blood queens so haunting is not the strangeness of their customs, but the familiarity of their intentions. They wanted to be more than women, more than flesh. They wanted to be symbols. Some wrapped themselves in linen to preserve their bones. Some wrapped themselves in legend to preserve their memory. They understood that true power is not control over land or people, but control over narrative. If people fear you, they remember you. If they worship you, they repeat your name. If they envy you, they become your disciples. Blood was never just blood. It was the ink of legacy. We like to imagine that we have evolved beyond such thinking. That civilization has refined our understanding of greatness. That we no longer need to terrify to be respected. But look closely. Look at the way society treats strength in women even now. A woman who shows kindness is praised. A woman who shows dominance is feared. A woman who is silent is pitied. A woman who is unbreakable is punished or immortalized. The world still does not know what to do with a woman who refuses to bow. So they call her unnatural, dangerous, unfeminine, serpent, temptress, tyrant. They called Cleopatra all of these things. And in doing so, they ensured that we would remember her forever. History has always been kind to gentle men and cruel women. For men, brutality is ambition. For women, ambition is brutality. A king may slaughter thousands and still be called strong. A queen may raise her voice and be called monstrous. The Egyptian queens understood this imbalance. They did not hide from it. They embraced it. If the world was going to see them as terrible, then they would become terror itself. Better to be feared by all than patronized by many. But the deeper question remains, is fear inherently immoral? Or is it simply another tool of survival? We praise lions for their majesty but condemn queens for their dominance. We marvel at storms but mock those who embody them. We celebrate male conquerors for their ruthlessness and call them legends, yet when women wield the same intensity, we rewrite their stories as seductions, scandals, or madness. The queens of Egypt refused to be softened into cautionary tales. They forced the world to speak of them not as wives or mothers, not as accessories to power, but as power itself. Their rituals, no matter how strange or brutal they appear to us now, were not acts of insanity. They were acts of clarity. They saw the truth humanity still tries to ignore. No one remembers the quiet. No one builds monuments to the modest. No one writes hymns for the obedient. Legacy is carved by those willing to loom large, to unsettle, to haunt. Their blood rituals were not for beauty. They were for scale. They did not just want to live. They wanted to echo. And echo they did. Their names are spoken thousands of years later, whispered across museum halls, printed on children's textbooks, debated in academic halls, reenacted in films, romanticized, demonized, misunderstood, but never forgotten. Could any of us accept that bargain? Would we trade comfort for eternity? Would we endure hatred for immortality? Would we bathe our souls in darkness just to ensure no one ever dared erase us? Most would say no. Most would rather live softly and be forgotten gently. But deep inside, beneath layers of civility, there is a flicker, a spark of envy. A part of us that looks at these queens and thinks, they did not apologize for existing loudly. They did not shrink to make others comfortable. They did not wait to be acknowledged. They declared themselves inevitable. In a world that constantly demands humility from women, their arrogance feels almost divine. And perhaps that is why they linger in our minds. Not because of the blood they used, but because of the boldness it represented. They were not ashamed of wanting more. Today, ambition is disguised behind modesty. Desire is cloaked in caution. People chase fame but pretend they stumbled into it. People crave dominance but insist they are humble. The Egyptians would have called that hypocrisy. They valued honesty and hunger. If you wished to be great, you were expected to say it. If you wanted eternity, you had to claim it, not hope for kindness. That is why they built pyramids instead of pleading for remembrance. The world today rewards those who hide their intentions. But the world remembers those who never did. we must also confront another unsettling reality. The line between devotion and manipulation is thinner than we like to admit. Were Egyptian subjects fooled into worshipping their rulers, or were they willing participants in the illusion? Humans crave something to revere. Even now, we build shrines to musicians, athletes, influencers, leaders. We imitate their style, echo their words, defend their flaws. Is that so different from inscribing hymns to queens upon temple walls? The medium changed. The instinct did not. The queens understood that worship does not come from goodness. It comes from magnitude. You can be adored for kindness, but you can only be venerated for power. And veneration, unlike affection, does not fade. Affection dies when people change. Veneration survives even when people suffer. No one died for someone they merely liked. But people die for someone they believe in. These queens did not want to be liked. They wanted to be believed in. And belief requires awe, or requires fear. So perhaps the question is not whether they were cruel. Perhaps the better question is whether they could have ruled any other way. Could a woman in a world of conquest survive through gentleness? Could a throne surrounded by jackals be guarded with kindness? Could a queen without teeth last longer than a season? History suggests otherwise. Empires are not preserved through grace. They are preserved through presence. And presence is rarely soft. Yet for all their strength, the Egyptian queens were not cold. Their rituals may seem harsh, but their purpose was tender in its own way, to protect themselves from erasure. They fought not for immediate dominance but for eternal acknowledgement. They did not chase fleeting pleasures. They chased permanence. And permanence is a lonely, merciless pursuit. Most people live within one lifetime. The queens lived in two. First in flesh, then in legend. Which is more real? The woman who walked the palace halls, or the figure we still envision cloaked in gold, bathed in scarlet light? Flesh decays. Myth does not. If they had chosen softness, would we know their names? If they had ruled gently, would their faces be carved into temple walls? If they had spoken quietly, would we be speaking of them now? The truth is uncomfortable but undeniable. History remembers extremes, not moderation. Legends are not born from restraint. They are forged in excess. We do not tell stories of those who lived wisely and died peacefully. We tell stories of those who defied, who provoked, who terrified, who demanded the world look at them. That is what Egyptian queens mastered better than any ruler before or after, the art of being unforgettable. And so we arrive at the final paradox. We condemn their rituals. We recoil at their methods. Yet we keep returning to their names. We study them. We dramatize them. We immortalize them again and again. We say we disapprove. But our fascination betrays us. Perhaps we do not truly fear them. Perhaps we fear becoming like them, bold enough to abandon restraint, audacious enough to live without apology, powerful enough to prioritize legacy over acceptance. For deep inside every human being lies a conflict between humility and grandeur, between safety and significance, between living quietly and being remembered violently. The Egyptian queens made their choice. And whether we like it or not, we stand in the shadow of that decision. Maybe one day, thousands of years from now, someone will walk among the ruins of our own civilization. They will find statues of influencers, murals of politicians, archives of billionaires, profiles preserved in endless streams of data. They will wonder about our rituals of power, our obsessions, our sacrifices. And perhaps they will ask the same question we now ask of Egypt's queens: was it vanity? Or was it survival? And maybe, just maybe, they will realize what we are now beginning to understand. Legacy is a hunger older than language. Power is a mask worn differently across eras but carved from the same material. And immortality, true immortality, is not granted by gods. It is taken by force, sealed in fear, and remembered in awe. So let the world debate their morality. Let scholars argue over symbols and residue. Let skeptics dismiss the blood as myth. It changes nothing. The queens achieved what they desired. They are still here, watching from sarcophagi, whispering through carved stone, flickering in torchlit halls, laughing softly beneath desert sands. They did not live gently. They did not die quietly. They turned life into legend. And legends, unlike flesh, do not end.